Okay, let's start. Good evening, Prof. Miguel, and good morning to Pak Lukman, the head of Plant Protection Department, students, teachers, and colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank to Prof. Altieri for his contribution to our academic with teaching since when? I think since 2 years ago, and hopefully can further develop to other activities such as research. And for today's lecture, we will learn about the introduction of agroecology from Prof. Altieri. But before Prof. Altieri give his lecture, the head of Plant Protection Department will give some word to welcome Prof. Altieri and maybe give a bit motivation to student as well. Time is yours, Pak Lukman.
Thank you, Bu Uma. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning to all and good evening, Prof. Altieri. Welcome back to our class. It is really an honor for us to meet you again in this event, which is a 3-in-1 lecture program for Agroecosystem Management course, which is attended by 4th semester student of Agroecotechnology study program, and also several colleagues from our faculty of Agriculture, and also others. I think you are familiar with this program, so on this occasion, I would like to express my deepest gratitude for your kind approval and willingness, and your contribution in this course, and since 2 years ago. So, yeah. Thank you very much, Prof. Altieri. And also your contribution to give lecture to our students to broaden the knowledge and also the competency in agroecology and agroecosystem management. With this course, I believe it will improve the competency of our students, and hopefully also this collaboration can continue to be closer and closer, and also realize in other aspects such as research or other maybe like mentioned by Uma. Maybe in the future, not only online, maybe Prof. Altieri, you can come to visit Malang someday. Okay, I think that's all what I want to say. And to the student, please keep follow this and join this. And I think it is very important to your knowledge and also the competence. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Pak Lukman. And to start the lecture, let me provide a short biography of Prof. Altieri. Because they are new student in this course, so they maybe still do not really know Prof. Altieri. So Prof. Altieri, Miguel Altieri is a professor of agroecology in Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, University of California, Berkeley. And he has a wide range of experience on sustainable agriculture development, including working with FAO on a globally indigenous agricultural heritage system. And then he was also working with a consultative group, International Agricultural Research, CGIR, and then with many international NGOs as well. And some students, they actually already have a background on agroecology in the first year, but it was only how do you call it, in the aspect of science. But then agroecology developed further on practices and movement, and maybe then Prof. Altieri will explain more on this aspect in this course. So thank you, Prof. Altieri, for your availability to give our student a lecture on this agroecological. And then please, now we give the time to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lukman, Uma, and Sylvie for your invitation again. As you know, I will give 2 lectures this week, and next week, Professor Clara Nichols, who is in Europe, and I don't know what time in Europe will be when she has to lecture, but she will be joining you on the application of agroecology more to pest management, the use of biodiversity, and so on. What I'm going to do in these 2 lectures is, 1, explain what agroecology is as a science and a set of practices and a social movement. And then tomorrow I will talk about how do we use agroecology to transition from an agriculture that is based on monocultures and high inputs and so on, to an agriculture that is more resilient, more sustainable, more biodiverse. So that's basically what I'm going to be doing, and I'm going to start sharing the screen. So when we talk about agriculture, really, we're talking about the artificialization of nature. We take an ecosystem, let's say a mature forest, the tropical forest, and we convert it into a monoculture of, for example, rice or corn or whatever crop. And by doing that, we reduce the biodiversity of that ecosystem, and therefore the system relies on external inputs, because the natural ecosystem is based on biodiversity that is interacting, and through these interactions between plants and animals and microorganisms and soils, etc., there is a set of processes that allow the system to sponsor its own function. There is nutrient cycling, there's pest regulation, etc., etc. So we don't need to intervene in a natural ecosystem. But when we reduce the biodiversity to a point where we have just a monoculture, then obviously the self-regulatory mechanisms of the ecosystem are lacking, and we need to have external inputs in the form of management intensity. And what we're looking for in agroecology are systems that have high levels of biodiversity and low levels of inputs from the outside. So in agroecology, we're not talking so much about an agriculture that depends on inputs, but more an agriculture that depends on ecological processes. So today in the world, we have huge monocultures dominating the landscape. There's about 1.5 billion hectares of agriculture in the world, and 80% of them are monocultures, as you can see here. And then we also have small-scale farms that have a totally different logic of production. They're more small-scale, more diversified. They're surrounded by a natural matrix. As you can see, for example, this is a typical small farming community in the highlands of Guatemala in Central America. And I'm sure in Indonesia, you will find the same situation, in which farmers have different plots with different crops surrounded by a matrix of natural vegetation, which actually lends ecological services to the farms. Many farmers, for example, collect litter from the forest to introduce it into their compost piles or into their soils, bringing biological activity, microorganisms that are present in the forest into the system. Or there could be many beneficial insects that are also living in this forest, and then they move into the crops in order to aid in the biological control of pests. So basically, a natural ecosystem has 6 inherent strengths: interdependency, self-regulation, self-renewal, self-sufficiency, efficiency, and diversity. And all these characteristics are key for the functioning of natural ecosystems. But what happens is that when we modify these natural ecosystems and we start reducing their diversity, specializing the systems into monocrops and so on, we start eroding this inherent strengths to a point that in agriculture we lack these inherent strengths. So one of the goals of agroecology is how do we bring back these strengths, interdependency, self-regulation, self-renewal, self-sufficiency, efficiency, and diversity back into agricultural production. This is basically the challenge of agroecology. Now, industrial agriculture, as I said, occupies about 80% of the 1.5 billion hectares of global arable land, usually using monocultures that are ecologically narrow and genetically homogeneous. And this makes the systems highly susceptible to insect pests, diseases, weeds, and also to climate change. And although the humanity could be feeding itself with more than 250,000 plant species, actually today there's only 3 crops that provide more than 50% of the human food. That's rice, wheat, and corn. And so it means that humanity is depending on just a basically small sample of the agrobiodiversity that could feed the world. And we see today the dependency on wheat, for example. You know, Ukraine, Russia, which are in conflict, are the main producers of wheat. And many countries in Africa are not going to have access to wheat because these countries are in a conflict and there is an interruption in the export of cereals. So it is very dangerous that humanity depends on just a few crops, not only because of the issues of food security and so on, but also the issue that I was telling you about the lack of diversity. So it is interesting that, for example, this picture shows in the United States back in 1903, there was a tremendous diversity of varieties of different crops. For example, 408 tomato varieties, radish 463, sweet corn 307, cabbage 554, etc. And there was a tremendous diversity of these crops. But then through specialization, through the selection of different varieties that would yield highly or that would respond well to fertilizers and so on, 80 years later, for example, instead of having 408 tomato varieties, today there's only 79. And instead of 307 varieties of corn, today there's about 12. Well, the same could happen with the varieties of rice, for example, in Southeast Asia, where there was a tremendous diversity. And then through the Green Revolution, there was an erosion of this genetic diversity, which put the systems in risk because the higher the genetic diversity, the more adaptive capacity of the agroecosystem. So this genetic uniformity has led to many crops to be highly vulnerable to epidemics and climatic variability. And this uniformity derives from powerful economic interest and legislative forces shaped by those holding corporate power. They have influence, you know, for example, legislature at the national level and also at the international level. And this genetic homogeneity makes the systems highly vulnerable, and there's a long history of cases. For example, in Indonesia in 1974, more than 3 million tons of rice were destroyed by a disease. And it is well known that in Ireland in 1946, there was a huge famine because potato was attacked by a disease, and therefore people starved. So having this genetic homogeneity is something that is highly risky for humankind. So because the systems are so they don't have self-regulation mechanisms. For example, they lack defenses against pests through biological control organisms and so on. There's a need to inject pesticides into the environment on an annual basis. In the world, in 2007, more than 5.2 billion pounds of herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides were actually injected into the biosphere. And you can see here Asia, which is the green. You can see that it is importing a tremendous amount of pesticides, which, as your video of the university showed, can have huge ecological toll in the environment, but also cause public health issues and so on and so on. And you know, nature always responds to unilateral tools that we use. For example, in the video of your university, there was a talk about the resistance of insects. There's more than 500 species of arthropods that are resistant to more than 1,000 different pesticides. The same thing with fungicide resistance and herbicide resistance. As a matter of fact, here in South America, in Brazil, in Argentina, the expansion of soybean monocultures, about 57 million hectares of soybean for oil extraction, which is actually exported to Europe and China and other countries for animal feed. You can see that the brown here is all soybean ready to be harvested, and all the green are weeds that are resistant to Roundup. These are genetically modified soybean, which actually is resistant to Roundup, the glyphosate. But because of the constant application of glyphosate, then many species, about 12 species of weeds, are already resistant to Roundup. So the other thing that happens is that as large-scale monocultures advance at the expense of natural habitats, you lose a lot of ecological services, such as biological control, but there's also possibilities for disease emergence. What happens is that when the monocultures advance, for example, oil palm in Asia, or soybean in South America and so on, they do it by cutting the forest. And within the forest, there are many species of wildlife, you know, bats, and different types of animals, birds, etc., that are living and coexisting with thousands of viruses. There's about 7,000 viruses that live with this wildlife, but they're contained within the forest. But as soon as we destroy the forest, then these animals become loose, and they get in touch with humans or with cattle, and that's the basis of zoonotic diseases, such as the aviar flu, the pork flu, and many other flus. And there's a hypothesis that COVID-19 could have evolved through a zoonotic transmission. So what happens is that industrial agriculture that occupies 70 to 80% of the land uses 5.2 billion pounds of pesticides, uses about 70% of the water, 80% of fossil fuels, produces more than 30% of the greenhouse gases, therefore warming the planet, creates conditions for pandemics, only produces 30% of the global food. So it's interesting that we're using most of the land to produce crops for biomass and not so much for food, and also for cattle production. So agroecology then comes as a science that wants to transition this agriculture, these monoculture systems that are highly dependent on external inputs and so on, to a system that are much more resilient, biodiverse, and ecologically sound. And it's a science that emerges from the influence of Occidental Western type of scientific disciplines like ecology, sociology, ecological economics, basic agricultural sciences like soils, plant pathology, entomology. We need to know about that, but also the traditional knowledge of farmers, because farmers in Asia and in Latin America have been farming for thousands of years and have created systems that have stood the test of time. And there are many lessons that we can learn from the systems. So this marriage of knowledge, this interaction between traditional farming knowledge and modern science, we call it dialogue of wisdoms. And from that dialogue of wisdoms emerges principles that are the ones that govern how agroecosystems function. And these principles take different technological forms depending on the social, environmental, political, economic situation of each region. But the principles of agroecology are universal. It's just that the forms, the technological forms are different. So one of the first influences of agroecology is obviously ecology. It's the mother science of agroecology. And there are certain principles of ecology that we need to understand, because we need to restore these principles in agricultural systems. So the first principle is networks. Living systems are nesting within other living systems. So there's networks of networks. So for example, when you study the insect community, well, that insect community is not isolated. It's connected to the plant community and also to the fungi community, and everybody's interacting. So you have subsystems that are and networks of interactions that have no boundaries and that they're interacting constantly. The second principle is cycles, there's continual flows of matter and energy in the environment, and all living organisms produce waste. But an ecosystem does not generate waste, because one species waste becomes another species food. So in other words, matter and nutrients and so on are cycling continually through the web of life that is present in the ecosystem. Solar energy is fundamental because it is transformed into chemical energy by the photosynthesis of plants, which is the mechanism that drives the ecological cycles. So plants are what is called the primary producers, the ones that receive the solar energy, transform it into chemical energy, into sugars and so on. And then from the plants get organized the food webs above ground. For example, you have herbivores and predators and parasitoids and so on that organize food webs above ground. And below ground, you also have very complex communities of microorganisms that are interacting, all actually being fed by the plants. Also, it is very important that in ecosystem there's a lot of partnership. That means life did not take over the planet by competition, but more by cooperation, partnership, and networking. This is very important because, we have been highly influenced by the way Darwin's theory was interpreted, in which, you remember that competition explained everything and that the survival of the fittest and so on. In systems, you find a lot of collaboration, a lot of cooperation, a lot of symbiosis that are happening, and proto-cooperation, and all kinds of positive interactions that are happening. So this is what we want to do. We want to design farming systems in which the species are complementing each other rather than competing. And obviously, the other principle is diversity. Ecosystems achieve stability and resilience through the richness and complexity of their ecological webs. So in other words, the greater the biodiversity of an ecosystem, the more resilient they will be. So that's why, a lot of research shows that when you have mixed cropping systems, agroforestry systems, and you compare them to monocultures, the incidence of diseases and pests is much lower in polyculture systems. And there's a dynamic balance. An ecosystem is flexible. There's a kind of, for example, a population is fluctuating, but it's fluctuating within a certain optimal values. So you don't have these explosions, this exponential growth of suddenly of a particular species. They're all kind of they're all kind of interacting, and they're all kind of fluctuating within certain optimal values. So when we compare a natural ecosystem with a mechanized agroecosystem, we see that there are very key differences immediately. The first one is that the system has a high level of ecosystem organization. That means a high level of biodiversity, the natural ecosystem. And these organisms, this biodiversity is interacting, and through the interactions, they sponsor the nutrient cycling, the biotic regulation, and so on and so on. And then there's a huge level of reinvestment of biomass and nutrients and information and energy, because there is very little export in the natural ecosystem. When we create a mechanized agroecosystem, we have a system that lacks ecosystem organization, that therefore doesn't have biodiversity, is not able to sponsor nutrient cycling, biological regulation of pests, and so on. And there's very little reinvestment because most of the biomass is exported. We take it out, for food, for fiber, whatever, for biomass, for feeding cattle, whatever. So here we're learning that in order to make the system more sustainable, we have to have a high level of ecosystem organization in order to sponsor key processes like nutrient cycling, biological regulation, and we need to reinvest the energy and the biomass that has been taken out by the agricultural system, by the harvesting. And that can be done through addition of organic matter as compost, green manures, et cetera, integrating animals. There are many mechanisms and so on and so on. So the ecosystem organization, the level of biodiversity, we can enhance it with agroforestry systems, intercropping systems, complex crop rotations, and so on. So in other words, what we have done in agriculture is we're going against the tendency of nature towards complexity. You see what happens if you cut a forest and then you abandon the field. What's going to happen is there's going to be a succession. That means the system is going to evolve towards complexity. But then what we do in agriculture is we put a barrier, a chemical barrier, in order not to allow that succession to continue. So we use herbicides or pesticides and so on in order to stop the succession. And we establish a young, immature ecosystem composed of crops and usually monocultures. So what agroecology is saying is that we need to accompany the tendency of nature towards complexity by using very complex farming systems where we have crops and trees and animals all interacting together in different designs. And that would be the strategy to do instead of going against nature, accompanying nature in its tendency towards complexity. So a general principle then in agroecology, influenced by ecology, is that the more an agroecosystem resembles the structure and function of an ecosystem of their biogeographic region, the higher the probability that such agroecosystem will be sustainable and resilient. So we want to somehow observe the natural ecosystems of our region and try to mimic them as it has been done by small farmers in many parts of the world. So in nature, this tendency towards complexity is called succession. So for example, if you cut a forest, that forest will recover again, but it will go through a successional process. At the beginning, you will have the pioneering species like grasses and forbs and so on. And then comes later shrubs, and then young trees, and then a mature forest. But this forest, these forbs, these grasses or these animal species prepare the conditions in order for these plants, the shrubs, to emerge, to germinate. So all the ecological information of the forest is already here. The seeds of the trees, the seeds of the shrubs are here, but they will only germinate and they will only be part of the successional phase when the conditions are proper. So this stage here prepares the soil and the microclimatic conditions for the shrubs to come in. The shrubs prepare the conditions for the trees, and then the trees start growing and evolving in a diverse system and coming to a climax forest, a mature forest. So when we look at the process in this graph here, the above graph, you will see that there's a tendency of increasing biomass production, net productivity, and biomass, as you can see here. But then there will be a certain level of equilibrium. It's not exponential. It doesn't tend towards producing more and more and more. There's a point where you have this stability here. And this is what nature does. And in agriculture, we want to force, our systems. We want them to produce 10 tons, 15 tons, 20 tons per hectare, and so on and so on. We push the system, and that goes against the rules of nature, because nature really stabilizes productivity at a certain point. So in Central America, there are farmers that have that follow the succession. So for example, they start with corn and beans, and then this corn and beans is followed by shrubs like more perennial crops such as bananas and avocados and papaya and things like that. And then you end up with a forest that is composed mainly of rubber and cacao and coffee or whatever, and palm trees and so on, that are going to be providing food for the people. So here you can see the succession: beans, maize, cassava, banana, coconut, cacao, rubber, and you end up with a system similar to a natural forest. So farmers start, with a corn and bean association in many parts of Latin America, but also I've seen it in Asia. And within here already, some farmers have planted some shrubs, some trees, and then later on, the more perennial plants start dominating, adding biomass to the system, and you end up with a system actually that is like a story building with different levels, an agroforestry system in which you can close the cycles of nutrients, because the nutrients that are leached in the annual crops are captured by the deep roots of the trees and taken back into the system. So at the end, you end up with a mature system. So let me show you an example that I've seen of a succession analog cropping system in Brazil, where the farmer specializes in cocoa production, chocolate. And but here you can see the cocoa plants, but they are all mixed with other species. You have corn, cassava, bananas, different types of plants all mixed together. Little by little, the trees start developing some other species along with the cacao, and there's a huge accumulation of biomass in the soil. This is very important. And then you have a system with 3 or 5 strata, like a building, but look at the tremendous amount of biomass in that soil that is actually sponsoring the fertility of the soil, the biological activity of the soil, which is the basis for the productivity of the system. And then you end up, with a system that resembles a natural ecosystem. But agroecosystems are not just the product of ecological processes. As you know, it is the product of the interaction between nature and humans. So usually the interaction between nature and human systems, social systems, develops an agroecosystem that, depending on the balance of that ecosystem, how well the social system manages the system, it will succeed or it will collapse. So one of the examples of interaction of nature that has resulted in complex agroecosystems that have stood the test of time are the ones used by small farmers, or what we call campesinos or peasants here in Latin America. And these farmers, which you have many of them, thousands of them in Indonesia, actually hold globally about 7,000 species of crops and about 2 million local varieties of different crops. So, the Green Revolution only developed about 7,000 varieties. The farmers have 2 million. That means they hold the agrobiodiversity, the genetic diversity that is the key for the agriculture of the future. And these farmers, in general, throughout the world, although they occupy only 25 to 30% of the land, use only 30% of the water, 20% of the fossil fuels, and they cool the planet, therefore, produce 50 to 70% of the food consumed globally. This is something really interesting. Actually, FAO has supported this data, in which actually, when we eat, we need to thank a small farmer, because they are the ones that are producing the food, although they can only control 25 to 30% of the land. So how do they reach those levels of productivity? They produce 70% of the food that the world eats, but only using 25 to 30% of the land. Is because they have co-evolved with the nature developing these agricultural systems. Farmers have a very deep knowledge of nature, and there are many studies that have shown that farmers can classify plants and animals and soils using different indicators. They can also distinguish ecogeographical units, and they can predict climatic phenomena, not so much today because of the climate change. And all this knowledge results in the modification of landscapes using particular appropriate technologies in agroecosystems that produce thousands of products that maintain the livelihoods of not only the rural people, but urban people. And these people have what we call a knowledge system that is similar to ours. In a way, they have a corpus, that means a theory. They also have a practice, but they have also another dimension that we actually lack in our scientific approach, which is the cosmology. Then they have kind of a spiritual relationship, many of them, with the land. In Latin America, we call it La Pachamama, the Mother Earth. Farmers do all kinds of ceremonies in order to thank Mother Earth or ask for permission to Mother Earth to do different practices. And it's so sophisticated, this knowledge, that, for example, you have different groups that can identify, for example, the Ifugao in the Philippines. Indigenous people can recognize 2,000 species of plants, or the Mayas in Mexico, 980 plants. And the same with species, of animals. The Aguaruna, 800 species of animals, the Ifugao, 597. So a child of one of these communities can identify hundreds of species, and many times the children in our societies don't recognize anything. They think that the tomato comes from the refrigerator. So farmers then manage the systems with this knowledge that has accumulated and has co-evolved, through centuries. And for example, let me show the example of the coffee in Mesoamerica, where coffee is part of a forest. We have a word in Spanish called cafetal, that means the coffee system, but it not only produces coffee, produces 150 different species of plants that are present in that system. So you have many of these plants are food, medicine. There's also bird species, bat species living in this forest. And farmers then have to have a very intricate knowledge of these systems, because they need to know, here's the coffee, but there's several other species of plants interacting with the coffee. When are you going to prune? When are you going to fertilize? When are you going to harvest? 150 different species. The most sophisticated organic farmer that I know manages 25 species. In our farm here in Colombia, we have about 25 species of plants. That's about it. These farmers have a very, very complex systems and a very intricate knowledge that allows them to manage these systems. And from this system, then they harvest many species. I mean, there's coffee, but in addition to coffee, they obtain fungi, flowers, canes, plantains, etc., different types of products that are going to be going for the local market, for example, or for the national and international market. Many farmers, for example, passion fruit or mangoes and so on are being exported, but at the same time, they don't leave aside the need to produce for the local food, the local markets, the regional markets, and also for their own subsistence. So for their own food security. Well, this example is about rice, which much more about rice than me, but I wanted to show you some examples of rice that I have seen in China as part of the GS processing of FAO that I was involved some years ago. I have to move because I have to plug my computer. Just a second, please. So as you know, in Indonesia and Thailand, in many countries, you have rice systems. But these systems in China are quite interesting because they manage the systems in terraces, just like you do. They have perennial vegetation surrounding the system or within the system as corridors. You have, when the dry season comes, they plant other crops and so on and so on. And within the systems, you're going to find other animals. For example, fish like carp. And then these fish play ecological roles in the system. In addition to supplying protein for the communities, you can see that they play an important function. For example, they control weeds. They also control insects because they push the plant. They have a certain behavior, pushing the plant, and then the leafhoppers fall and then they eat them. And so here you have, biological control function of this fish, in addition to being a source of food. And also some of them use azolla. As you know, it's a mix of a fern and an algae, which can fix about 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. 40% of that goes to the rice. So that's the natural fertilizer. But azolla can exert some problems when you have fish because it can suffocate the oxygen. So many times farmers bring ducks. Just I know that Uma does a lot of work on this. And these ducks, and she can explain much better than me, the role that ducks can play in the system in terms of controlling weeds and snails and pests and so on and so on. So at the end, basically what you have is a system where the farmers put together an ensemble of biodiversity, an assemblage of biodiversity where they have rice and ducks and fish and azolla and so on. And through their interactions, these components start promoting the processes that are fundamental for the agroecosystem to function. So biological control of weeds, biological control of insects, nutrient cycling, nitrogen fixation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what agroecology is in an essence, is the art of putting together functional biodiversity, a biodiversity that is going to, by being present in the system, is going to play ecological roles through interactions that are going to allow for the system to function. So soil fertility is going to be generated, biological control of pests is going to be generated, and so on and so on. Another example of this type of complex agroecosystems in which different components play different roles and allows the system to sponsor its function is the milpa, or the corn bean squash system, that is typical of the Mayan communities in Mesoamerica. And they call it the three sisters. They grow them up together. And there's a lot of interactions that start happening when you put this plant together. On the one side, the corn is a living support for the beans that usually climb on the corn. But at the same time, they provide sugars to feed the nitrogen fixing bacteria on the bean roots, because the roots of the beans, as you know, are colonized by rhizobium, which converts nitrogen in soil to boost growth. And then the pumpkin, or the squash, is kind of a living mulch that shades the soil, control weeds, and helps retain moisture, inhibiting evaporation from the soil. So you can see many interactions that happen here, but also, and Clara will explain also how corn and bean associations sponsor a general beneficial biota that leads to the control of pests in these systems. So by putting together these crops, you have interactions that are very complex below ground and above ground. And I'm going to explain that a little bit in more detail tomorrow. And so as agroecologists, we need to understand this complexity, this complex interactions. It's very, very important. This is why agroecology is much more and it's not input intensive, it's knowledge intensive. It requires understanding, you know, what are going to be the interactions and the benefits and the complementarities that happen when you put crops together like corn and beans. Not only above ground, what happens with the pests or the diseases or the productivity, what happens at the soil level, below ground, what are the interactions that are happening between different microorganisms that are present here. And so a lot of people have found that the systems are more productive than monocultures. For example, here you can see different types of intercropping systems with this value called land equivalent ratio, or LER, above 1. You can see 1.6, 1.5, 1.4. Okay, how is that calculated? So for example, let's say that you put corn and beans together. You grow them together, but you grow them in monocultures. And then you calculate the yield of each crop. So corn monoculture produces 4 tons, 4,000 kilos, intercropped 3,000 kilos. The bean in monoculture 1,000, and the bean in polyculture or intercropped is 750. So you could conclude, oh, the monoculture of corn has 3,000 kilos, and sorry, the monoculture has 4,000 kilos, and the intercrop 3,000. So it's more productive, the corn monoculture. But remember that you're overlapping two crops on the same piece of land at the same time. So what you have to do is calculate what is called the land equivalent ratio, which is a formula where you plot the corn yield in intercropping over the corn yield in monoculture, plus the yield of the bean in intercrop over the yield of bean in intercrop, plus whatever. If you have more crops, you can add them. And then you can see here that you end up with a value of 1.5. That means that you need 1.5 hectare of monoculture to obtain the same yield that you obtain in 1 hectare of polyculture, because you're overlapping two systems, and the crops put together occupy much better the land, make a better use of the resources of the land, the water, the nutrients, the sunlight, and so on and so on. In addition to other effects on pests and diseases and weeds and so on. So you can see then that agroecology is kind of a hybrid science that is influenced by different Western scientific perspectives, but also traditional knowledge. And it's an integrative science that combines ecological, agronomic, and sustainability sciences, transcending the technoproductive dimensions of agriculture by incorporating cultural, social, economic, and political perspectives into the analysis of agriculture and food systems. So it's very important to understand this, because agroecology, as Uma was saying, has social dimensions. You know, many of the technical problems that we face are also social, they're also economic, they're also political. And the situation that we're facing today in the world in terms of hunger, for example, doesn't have anything to do with the fact that we're not producing enough food. As a matter of fact, we're producing much more food that we can eat. But what happens is it doesn't reach the poor because they are poor. Poverty explains that, or lack of access to land to produce the food, and so on and so on. So it's very important to understand this dimension. And that's why agroecology then is influenced by, as I said, it's a hybrid science. It's influenced by environmental history, political ecology, ecological economics, rural sociology, ethnoecology, sustainability science, all the agricultural sciences, biological pest control, soil biology, etc., ecology, obviously, etc. You can see there's a tremendous influence from different perspectives. And this is why we call agroecology a systemic science, in the sense that you cannot understand the problems of agriculture in isolation. They're all systemic. That means that if something goes wrong with one component, it will affect other components. For example, if you fertilize your crop with too much nitrogen, you're going to create pest problems. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. So everything is interconnected. Unfortunately, in our formation as scientists in agriculture, we have not taken into consideration that holistic perspective. So agroecology then derives into agroecological principles. These principles take the form of practices, and these practices set in motion processes. So, in other words, for example, one agroecological principle would be to enhance organic matter in the soil in order to promote biological activity. Well, one practice of that would be adding green manures, growing crops in rotation and legumes that are going to fix nitrogen in a rotation. Well, that practice that reflects the principle of agroecology sets in motion processes such as nutrient cycling, such as nitrogen fixation, and so on and so on. And what we need, indicators, we need to develop indicators that allow us to understand whether the agroecological principles or the processes are functioning well as we proceed in the design of new agricultural systems. So the principles of agroecology are the following: enhance recycling of biomass and balance nutrient flow. We want to secure favorable soil conditions, especially increase the organic matter content and the biological activity of the soil. We want to minimize the losses of resources such as water, nutrients, genetic diversity, etc. We want to break the monoculture and increase diversity at the genetic and species levels and also at the landscape level. And it's not just adding diversity per se. We need to add diversity, just like in the case of the rice with the fish and the plants and the ducks and so on. We want to have diversity that is going to complement each other through beneficial biological interactions and synergisms. Now, agroecology as a science builds a critique of conventional agroeconomic sciences as they promote a disciplinary, reductionist, Western industrial technological approach, ignoring the role of local traditional and indigenous knowledge in the development of sustainable agri-food systems. So agroecology, in a way, is contestatory in the sense that it criticizes conventional agronomic sciences because they have led to these systems of agriculture that are, that are not sustainable, that are not resilient. And what has happened is that, I'm sorry that these are in Spanish, but these are the disciplines of that we study in the university. Now that you're studying there, you take soils, you take entomology, you take plant pathology, you take weed control, you take economics, whatever. And each one of these disciplines is studying what part of the system, one part of the system. It's very Cartesian, our formation comes from Descartes, that he said that you cannot study the whole, you have to study it by pieces. And so you study biology, you study soils, and you just look at the soil. You study entomology, you just look at the insects. You study plant pathology, you just look at the pathogens. And the hope is that all this knowledge, this disciplinary knowledge, is going to lead to an integrated, holistic view of the agroecosystem, which doesn't happen. So this is what agroecology does. It tries to provide a holistic, integrative view of the agricultural system. So in other words, we work with a black box, concept. We know that if this is the agroecosystem, we put inputs into the system, we are going to obtain yield. The more inputs, the more yield. And maybe I know some part of the plant box. I'm an expert in entomology, but and my friend here is an expert on soil. But how does soil and insects interact? We have no idea. They're very similar to medicine. Doctors become specialized in the heart, others become specialized in the kidneys. And when you go to a doctor and you say, well, my kidney probably is in trouble, they say, okay, you gotta go to a specialist because I don't know anything about kidney, I know about heart. Nobody looks at the whole system in a holistic way. So this is what agroecology tries to do, is to decipher the black box, which is very complex. Okay, I'm going to jump here ahead a little bit. So, when we study agricultural systems, we can study them at different levels. For example, if we're doing a thesis, we usually establish experimental plots, and try to understand what is going on in this experimental plots, disregarding what happens in a broader way, in the broader environment. Then we can be in a real farmer's field where the farmer is interacting with it has a very complex system and there's all kinds of interactions, but we are not understanding how the landscape influences that farm. And then it turns out that this farm is inserted in a landscape matrix, and therefore we need to understand the interactions at a much broader level, at the landscape level. So there are different. That doesn't mean that you cannot do experimental plots. I'm just saying that there are different levels of interactions, and the interactions that you're gonna understand at this level are gonna be different from the interactions that happen at this level, and also at this landscape level, the interactions are gonna be much more geographic in scope and more complex to understand. So we can study at the plot level. We establish a plot within a farm to study whatever insect pests or diseases or whatever. We can study, we can key into, one part of that plot and try to understand what's going on there. Or we can look at the system much more broadly, a more broad system surrounded by natural vegetation, for example, and we want to understand how the forest influences the dynamics of insect pests in our field. Or at the complex matrix, landscape matrix, where I'm not just understanding what's happening in this little plot, but I'm trying to understand the dynamics of all this landscape with all the different components. You have agricultural fields, non-agricultural fields, natural vegetation, et cetera, and they're all interacting and affecting the water cycle, affecting the microclimate, affecting the nutrient cycles, the pest dynamics, and so on and so on. So, but this is the reality where farmers live. They live inserted in landscapes, and these interactions are complex, and they're there. They're determining the outcomes many times of their farming systems. I'm just going to. Okay, so I wanted to go now to start perhaps finishing a little bit and giving some time for discussion and questions and ideas that you may have, because I think that makes a session like this interesting. So we have the principles, and a lot of people today are talking about agroecology. They're saying that they're doing agroecology, and that farmers have an agroecological farm, and so on and so on. And we need to know why, because agroecology is a science that can study any agricultural system. There are so many names: permaculture, conservation agriculture, ecological intensification, organic agriculture, integrated pest management, et cetera, organic farming. So each one of these have their own principles. Organic agriculture has its own principles, permaculture, biodynamic agriculture, they all have their principles, and I respect them. But agroecology is like in ecology. Ecology is the science that understands how nature works. So you can study a tundra ecosystem in the Arctic, or you can go to the lowland tropics and study a complex tropical ecosystem. But the principles are the same. The processes that happen in the tundra, in the Arctic, in that ecosystem are the same. Nutrient cycling, energy flow, the same processes are happening than in the tropical forest. It's just that the species composition and the dimension and the significance are different. So agroecology allows us to understand any agricultural system. You can go to a permaculture farm or an organic farm that follows the principles of the organic pioneers, and see if the agroecological principles are being utilized or not in the system. And many times in California, at least, much of the organic farming is input substitution monocultures. They just change the package of inputs. Instead of using chemical inputs, they use biological inputs, organic inputs, but the structure of the farm is the same. It's a monoculture. They grow papaya, or they grow strawberries, or whatever, organic rice or whatever, but it's a monoculture. So when you go to that farm and you apply the agroecological principle, you'll see that that farm is not functioning correctly, that you could optimize it, despite the fact that they're using the organic principles, which I respect. So the important thing is that we have developed a methodology that allows us to try to understand if farmers are using the agroecological principles. So these are the principles. The principles, we already saw them, there are 6 principles. Here they are, and recycling of organic matter, organic matter content and soil biology, minimization of resource losses, species and genetic diversification, and enhancement of biological interactions. Okay, so you go to a farm and then you can say, well, this farmer is using compost, using cover crops, using mulching, is using crop rotation, or a group of farmers in a region, and then you can see which principle is this this practice connected to. So for example, compost application is definitely enhancing organic matter in the soil, and it's definitely minimizing resource losses. When you go to, for example, intercropping or agroforestry, you see that all the principles are connected to that practice. Okay, so that's kind of the first map that we do. We just kind of try to understand, okay, these farmers are using all these practices. Are these practices connected, reflected by the ecological principles? And the second is that you go to several farms, and this is a study we did in Japan, where you have the practices that the farmers are using, and then you can start saying, okay, for example, presence of vegetation around the farm, hedgerows, weedy borders, whatever. You can see that only 7 farms out of 10 had them. And so you develop a map like this, where you just basically describe what the practices are and which farmers are using those practices. So the indicators that we use, the first one is landscape diversity. The first thing that you observe in a farm is whether there's presence of hedgerows, vegetation strips, natural vegetation, weedy borders, whatever. You look at the landscape diversity. What is surrounding my farm? Is this farm surrounded by other monocultures, or is this farm surrounded by natural vegetation on one side and a forest on the other, whatever? The crop diversity, the number of crops grown in time and space. Are they growing just 1 crop, or are they growing 3 crops? The genetic diversity, are they using different varieties of the same species? For example, they grow rice, but how many varieties of rice? And out of those varieties, how many are local and how many are hybrids or modern varieties? Then soil quality, you look at the organic matter content, the recycling, the practices that enhance organic matter like composting, green manure, and so on. Then you look at the pest management practices, whether they're using biological, cultural methods, the level of dependency of external inputs, how much of the input that the farmer is using comes from the outside of the farm, and how many come from the inside of the farm. The interactions between the components, are they, for example, if they control the weeds, do they leave the weeds in the field so that those weeds decompose and become organic matter? That would be an interaction. Or do they have flowers around the field that attract beneficial insects that control the pest? That would be another interaction. So you start counting the interactions. And then the productivity and total farm output, you kind of figure out the level of productivity, how much is produced. They could have 10 different crops, 3 different animals, and they're all producing, and that would be considered the total farm output. So you start evaluating each one of these indicators. For example, in the landscape diversity, you go there and you say, okay, the farmer has less than 20% of the perimeter of the farm is surrounded by a diverse community of natural vegetation, you give them a 1. So the idea is that 1 would be a bad value for the indicator, and 5 would be optimal. So 5, more than 60% of the farm is surrounded by a diverse community of natural plants. Then you look at another indicator, organic soil management. For example, the soil has less than 1% control, organic matter. It's 100% of the soil is uncovered. It doesn't have any mulching. There's no recycling. There's no cover cropping, green manuring. So you give them a 1, and then you give 5 to a farmer that has very high organic matter content in the soil. The soil is covered by vegetation or residues or mulching. There's high level of recycling, and so on and so on. And then, you know, each one of these indicators, you give them a value, and then you plot them. And you can see here we have 4 farms that we're comparing. And you can see that this farmer out here, farm number 10, has kind of the best values compared to the, for example, to the red farm. Okay, so 2.5 would be kind of the threshold, and anything above 2.5 is moderate good. The better, the closer you are to 5, it would be best. So what this shows you, first of all, the difference between the farms, and the second shows you the weak points. So this farm, for example, the green one, number 3, has low landscape diversity. So that needs to be improved. This farm here, the red one, has very low landscape diversity. Crop diversity is not very high. Very low interactions between the different components, and so on and so on. So you can start saying on the one side, okay, these are the weak points of these farms. The principles are not being applied correctly, and they need to be optimized. So at the end, you can actually take a mean of all the indicators. Remember, each indicator has a value from 1 to 5. Well, you take an indicator, and you take all the indicators and you make a mean. And so you can see here all the farmers, and you can see that these farmers here, number 5, number 6, are above the others. Okay, when you plot, they're above 2.5 and they're above the others, and we call them the agroecological lighthouses. You know, the kind of model farms that these farmers that have very low values in the indicator would benefit from visiting the farmers and interacting with the farmer to learn what are they doing in order to reach these levels. Obviously, they still have room for improvement. They can go up to 5, but they are definitely above the other farmers, and they're applying the agroecological principles much better than the others. And this is where the interaction farmer to farmer can be very important in promoting you know, the extension and the scaling up of agroecology. So the objective is to improve soil health and fertility, creation of habitat for wild biodiversity and beneficial biodiversity, increase soil carbon sequestration. That can be done by minimizing the use of inputs, chemical inputs, minimizing soil disturbance, increasing organic matter content, combining crops and livestock and trees and crops, and having a lot of diversity in the system. And all of this will lead to the restoration of nutrient cyclings, the retention of water in the soil. You know, for every percentage of organic matter that you increase in the soil, you can increase the water retention. It's very important in areas that are being subject to drought due to climate change. We want to encourage natural pest control, natural pollination. We want to enhance the resiliency of our ecosystem to stress, and we want to minimize the emissions of greenhouse gases by our agricultural systems. So agroecology is a scientific approach. It's basically ecological science applied to the study and design of management of agroecosystems. It is a set of practices that try to mimic natural processes and harness biological interactions, as I show you. And it's a social movement because it supports smallholder farming aimed to enhance the food sovereignty as opposed to industrial agriculture. So farming systems through systemic and holistic approach according to local socioeconomic and agropedagogical context. This is very important that agroecology is the design of farming systems through a holistic and systemic approach, incorporating, as I mentioned before, indigenous and farmers' knowledge. So at the end, what agroecology pretends is to create an agriculture that is socially just, that is economically viable, that is culturally diverse, that is environmentally sound. And it leads, in order to reach that, we need to use agroecology to convert or to transition the conventional monoculture systems, industrial systems, to these more biodiverse and resilient systems. And in order to do that, you need the science of agroecology, but you also need the help of policies. You need local markets, extension methodology, research, participatory research, especially with farmers, farmer-to-farmer networks, institutional partnerships, all kinds of other components are going to be needed in order to make that transition of industrial agriculture to more agroecologically sound farming. So there is now a lot of interest in the amplification of agroecology or the scaling up of agroecology, which means that you need to co-create agroecological practices, combining farming and scientific knowledge. We need to identify the best agroecological practices and put them in the field. We need to systematize the practices to distill the factors of success and validating new insights. We need to share the lessons learned through dissemination and dialogue, farmer-to-farmer networks, and so on. We need to transform through research, education, policy, and investment. And we need to enable the further development and spread of agroecology in order to reach climate resiliency, food sovereignty, and social justice in our rural areas of the world. So with that, I wanted to finish here and then open up the floor for questions or discussions or whatever the group has. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Miguel. It's really, really compact a lecture. In Wageningen, it takes like 300 hours to finish this course, and you can pack it only less than 2 hours. So, so I hope this really stimulate students to learn further on this agroecology. The students next will have a course on sustainable agriculture and on organic plant production, which also we, especially in my part, I involve this agroecology thing, but still, because they are still in bachelor, so it's very, very little compared to the whole aspect of agroecology. So yeah, I myself actually have a lot of questions, but because this is for students, I hope students will come with their question. Other question from students? Sylvie? Sylvie? Okay, just to hello, Bu Sylvie.
Ya, Bu Uma.
Yeah, do you have any communication with students?
Yes, not yet. Question.
Okay, so maybe I can have one. You mentioned about organic agriculture before, but yeah, indeed, in Indonesia, because we you said also about small farm scale. But if in Indonesia, it's much more smaller than in other countries. I think it's less than a quarter hectare per farmer sometimes. So yeah, so then when they applied organic agriculture, they do not really use the principle of organic agriculture of agroecology. Mostly it is monoculture organic rice system. How do they can design this agroecological principle without losing their income in this very, very small size of farm?
Thank you. That's a very good question because it happens here also. The first thing is that it doesn't mean you have to have 50 species in the rice field. What you have to have are the species that are needed to make the rice field more productive and more stable in terms of pests and so on. For example, by using flowers around the farm, or using a rotation with some legume or something. And so that would be the diversity that you need. You don't need to have a very complex system with 150 species. What makes the system economically viable is not some, it depends on the market, obviously. Usually small farmers have very bad markets. They get paid very little. And what makes the viability is that they reduce the cost of production in more than 60%. Because if you use organic farming, usually that means that you have to use external inputs. You have to buy the compost if you don't make it in your farm, or you have to buy, whatever botanical insecticide or something. That's a cost of production. If you do apply the agroecological principles in different ways, you can reduce your cost of production by 60–70% because you don't need, because you are promoting processes in the rice system that is going to make the system, viable economically as well as ecologically. So that would be my answer. Now, what kind of design? That depends on the conditions that I don't know. But here, for example, in our farm here in Colombia, we, for example, we're growing different fruit trees, avocados and citrus and papaya and so on and so on. And we introduced a legume called peanut forage peanut as a cover. And we keep the part under the tree clean because it's very invasive. But we allow this peanut to grow in the field to control the weeds, and at the same time we cut it and we put it in the basement of the fruit trees as our source of fertilizer. So there you have a practice that is not a very complex system, but it has 3–4 different species of fruit trees, but then has a discover that flowers attracts beneficial insects, control weeds, control erosion because we're on kind of a little bit of slope, and at the same time generate so much biomass that we can cut it and feed the animals. We have chicken and cattle, and then at the same time put also biomass in the base of the fruit trees as a source of organic matter. And then at the same time, the manure from the animals combined with that biomass, we make the compost that we can also use as so we have zero dependence of fertilizers in the farm because we generate our biomass and our fertility here with our resources. So if farmers can do that, then it's not so much if they get a good price. Hopefully they get a good price, but usually they don't in the market, but they save so much money in production that makes the system viable economically.
Yeah, it's maybe more difficult, yeah, to apply the system in rice system because they have a very unique system containing water and yeah terrestrial environment. But anyway, is there any clue on how many percent the diversity should be created in an area?
How much what? Sorry?
A percent. How many
Percent what?
percent like from the total field, for example? Is it like, yeah, for example, if we want to have like hedgerows with flowers,
Oh,
what
yeah.
is the ideal percentage?
Yeah, usually, 10% is enough, but what matters is the distance.
Okay.
Because what we find is that, for example, let's say you have flowers in the border, and then the beneficial insects move from the flowers only 10 to 20 meters, then you have no protection in the rest of the area. So you have to put another flower strip in order to not have that type of gradient. So let's say that you have flowers around your field, but the beneficial insects move from that border to your field 20 meters, and your field is 60 meters long, then 20 meters are covered and 40 meters are not. So you need to have another strip. So that's the way we kind of calculate the area, but it's no more than 10% actually.
Okay, good then. So it's still feasible maybe for a smallholder farmer. Okay,
Yeah.
we have one question from student. This is in Indonesian, but I will try to translate in English. The question is there any like a second, how do you call it, a forest in Latin America, which is like a protected and people cannot use it, and then does this is this a forest then can be called applying principle of agroecology?
Because they don't cut the forest, or what? What the question? I didn't get it. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I can maybe there is problem with my laptop. The question is like if you have like how do you call it? It's a protected forest. It's second. Yeah, and if this also apply the principle of agroecology.
Yeah. Well, it depends on what kind of forest you have around your farm, because you see, you can have a forest of pine trees that don't play any function, or you can have a eucalyptus forest that don't play any function. They don't harbor biodiversity that is useful for the crops. So it doesn't mean that if you have a forest means that your system is agroecological. What makes it agroecological is that forest is lending ecological services to your farm. It's
To the farm.
It's a source of beneficial insects. It's a source of nutrients, of microorganisms, or whatever. Then okay, there's an interaction. Therefore, we can consider that the forest plays an ecological role in the production of this of the agricultural system. But it's not the fact that you have a forest that makes your farms, agroecological. That's why we look at different indicators, just one indicator. There seems to be another question there.
No, it's just like a confirmation. It's just like, okay, they are protected, but they are not beneficial to human because we cannot access the thing in this forest. So
if it's protected, you cannot access it. But the forest, if it's protected, the question is whether it has ecological functions that benefit the agricultural system that is on its side. So if I had to read this question using Spanish, I don't know if I would pronounce correctly, but I said, pada hutan tersebut tidak boleh.
That's correct. Good.
Maybe
So,
I can learn Indonesian.
but can you speak Indonesia? So yeah, because there is like some dilemma, many dilemma regarding to protected areas related to human thing,
Yeah.
especially when this area is actually already used by human for many years, and then suddenly the function is changed to protect it. So there is like conflict between human and then
Exactly.
the nature. Yeah. Bu Sylvie, how many hours do we have?
Around 5 minutes again.
Around 5 minutes. Yeah. Are there more questions? Otherwise, I want to, because you work a lot with GIAS. Yeah,
Yeah.
there is like co-culture rice fish in China, and then rice terraces in Ifugao, Philippines. And actually, I'm thinking a lot about this in Indonesia. We have something like a rice stripe system. It's very traditional, and it's gradually. So if we want to have this like protected under like GIAS, what are the processes?
You know, I have been out of GIAS for some years, but there's an application that you can go to the the website of the FAO, and there's an application form. It used to be, I don't know now. There's an application form that you apply, and then you describe the system and so on, and that goes to a committee that studies it and decides whether that would be a candidate. And then there has to be your government has to propose it then, because they have to sign an agreement between the Ministry of Agriculture and FAO to design a GIAS, which would be a globally ingenious or globally important agricultural heritage system that would be protected. And that has some implications. For example, I was involved very much in the one in Chile. You know, I'm from Chile originally, and there's a GIAS in the south of Chile, and that is a secondary center of potatoes, because the main center is the Andean region of Peru and Bolivia. But in the south of Chile, there's a secondary center of origin, and that means, for example, the government signed the agreement and the GIAS designation of FAO. That means, for example, that if you designate a rice system as a GIAS, that means that it doesn't mean that you keep it as a museum. It can evolve dynamically, but you cannot modify the system in a way that would take away what makes it a GIAS. So, for example, transgenic potatoes would not be allowed in the Chiloé island, because that would lead to potential transformation of the genetic makeup of the local varieties of potatoes, if a genetically modified potato is introduced. So that's the way it is protected. Or there could not be some kind of a trade agreement that would go against, you know, the well-being of the farmers, and so on and so on. So it has implications that are very interesting, because it's a tool to protect sometimes these heritage systems. It's like the UNESCO category, you know, of churches and humankind patrimony architecture, that you cannot paint it. You cannot go there and paint a church, you know, of red, you know, that would be against the heritage. Yeah. So if you want, I mean, I haven't been in touch with those people, but if you go through the website, you might find the guidelines. It would be really interesting. It would be really interesting to design, to promote one site in Indonesia.
In Indonesia, yeah, we have one we call Suba in Bali. It's related to irrigation there. Okay, Prof. Miguel, thank you very much for this very interesting course, and yeah, we will continue tomorrow. with how do we make a transition,
Transition.
from maybe to agriculture thing. And once again, thank you and see you tomorrow.
Okay, good
And
night.
Good night.
Morning to you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Monggo Bu Silvi, Pak Lukman.
Ya, terima kasih Bu Ima.
Sama.